In the rolling countryside of eastern Missouri, where the winters came early and the mornings often arrived wrapped in fog so thick it silenced the world, there once stood a seminary few now remember by name, though the stories that surround it have lingered like smoke. Built in 1857 on land donated by a devout widow named Eleanor Whitcomb, the Seminary of St. Elia was envisioned as a sanctuary, a place where young men called to priesthood could retreat from the temptations of the world and prepare their souls for lives of sacred service. But 5 years later, in the winter of 1862, that vision turned into a long, cold silence. On the night of January 3rd, the seminary bell was heard ringing once, sharply, at 2:11 a.m. No one had pulled the rope. The groundskeeper, an older man named Tobias Greaves, claimed the bell rope was already stiff with frost by the time he reached it. Inside the stone building, 18 young novices lay dead in their beds, each in their own dormitory cell, doors locked from the inside. There were no signs of violence, no trace of poison, no soot in the lungs, no wounds, no struggle, no panic. Their bodies were found as if they had simply stopped breathing in the middle of sleep, yet no cause of death was ever formally declared. The coroner, a physician from Jefferson County, submitted a single sentence in his final report. The breath of life departed from them in unity and in silence. That same day, without ceremony or public mourning, the local diocese dispatched 5 senior clergy to seal the dormitory floor and shutter the entire building. They instructed Tobias Greaves to remain on site, maintain the property, and admit no one without written ecclesiastical approval. Curiously, although the names of all 18 novices were recorded in the seminary's final ledger, full names, dates of entry, and assigned dormitories, none were ever buried in the cemetery that had been consecrated just months earlier for precisely that purpose. No funeral masses were held, no burial markers placed, and despite the seminary's proximity to several small towns, not a single family ever came to claim the bodies. In the 163 years since that winter, the official story has remained unchanged. A sudden, unexplained tragedy, followed by complete institutional silence. But in 1981, the records room of the Archdiocese of St. Louis suffered a minor electrical fire. While inspecting the water damage, archivist Helen Marlowe discovered a journal that had fallen behind an old filing cabinet. It was leather-bound, with a broken clasp and pages stiff from time. Its author, Father Anselm Theriot, spiritual director at St. Elias Seminary from 1858 until its closure. What Helen read in those pages would shake the foundations of everything she believed about her church, about the nature of obedience, and about what the church had buried, literally and figuratively, behind those stone walls in Missouri. The journal entries, meticulous and dated, begin as the reflections of a devout but deeply observant priest concerned about spiritual rot, taking root among his students. But as the months progress, his tone shifts from introspective to fearful, then desperate, and finally resigned. The entries describe flickering shadows in candlelit halls, whispered voices in empty dormitories, and signs that some novices had begun experiencing visions they could not explain, visions of places they had never visited, names they could not have known, and memories that did not belong to them. But perhaps the most chilling pattern, multiple entries indicate that each novice had confessed in private to dreaming of their own death, not in the abstract sense, but with vivid detail. Some described hearing bells that never rang. Others saw their own names engraved on headstones that did not yet exist. One novice, Brother Damien, had reportedly written his own eulogy and placed it under his mattress. It was discovered days after the tragedy. In its final sentence read, When we are gone, do not dig. Let the soil remain untouched, for we are not alone beneath it. That line has haunted every historian who's dared to examine the journal, for it implies a truth that no one has been able to verify, but no one can dismiss. That the cemetery behind St. Elias Seminary, the one reserved for its novices, was never meant for the living, and that perhaps the 18 who died that night were buried somewhere else entirely, or not at all. Helen Marlowe, driven by a mixture of academic obsession and quiet faith, began her own investigation in secret. Over the next 5 years, she interviewed descendants of clergy stationed near Saint. Elia during the 1860s combed through diocesan expense reports, even traced obscure land transfer documents. What she discovered was deeply unsettling. In March of 1862, 2 months after the novices' deaths, the archdiocese paid a local stoneworker named Carl Dietz a sizable sum for subterranean reinforcements beneath main seminary structure. The receipt is authentic, the timing is precise, but the seminary building was only 5 years old at the time, and no records exist of any structural concerns. Helen then tracked down blueprints of the original seminary. What she found was even more disturbing. The dormitory wing where the novices lived was never meant to have a basement, and yet, beneath the final blueprint, a faint notation had been added in pencil, almost invisible to the naked eye. It read, "Sub-level 1, do not map." That was all Helen needed. In 1987, under the guise of conducting an architectural preservation survey, she was granted a single afternoon inside the now-abandoned seminary. She brought a recorder, a flashlight, and a copy of Father Theriot's journal. What she found, and what she did not, will be the subject of Part 2. The air inside St. Elias Seminary had the texture of mildew and paper ash. Thick with age, brittle with something unspoken, Helen Marlowe stepped across the threshold at precisely 1:03 p.m. on November 9th, 1987. A cold front had rolled in that morning, and the surrounding forest seemed to lean inward, as if trying to reclaim the land the church had carved out over a century ago. The building's interior was frozen in time. Rows of rotting pews faced a pulpit choked in cobwebs. Old hymnals, their pages fused together by moisture, lay half open as though the faithful had simply disappeared mid-song. Helen moved quietly, aware that she was alone, but never feeling entirely unobserved. Armed with Father Theriot's journal, she matched landmarks in the text to the building's layout: the main chapel, the eastern stairwell, the west corridor, the one with 18 doors, each labeled not with names, but numbers, 201 through 218. This was the novices' hall. According to diocesan records, this entire wing had been blessed, sealed, and decommissioned in March of 1862. No official ever reopened those rooms. No renovation, no inspection, just silence. But what struck Helen most wasn't the decay. It was the symmetry. Every bed was still made. Every desk bore a crucifix. In cell 213, a candle had been burned down to a wax puddle and never cleaned. In cell 209, she found a rosary twisted tightly around the post of the bed as though gripped in fear. And in 2015, Brother Elijah's room, if the journal was accurate, she found something that did not belong to the 1800s at all. Folded and tucked behind the old iron bed frame, protected from dust and weather by the room's still sealed door, was a yellowed sheet of paper stamped 1973. It was a typed letter addressed to the archdiocese and signed by Father Benedict Arlo, a retired priest who had lived just 6 miles from the seminary until his death in 1975. The letter was a warning. "I don't know what was buried beneath the floor," he wrote, "but it was never at rest. I served at St. James Parish from 1939 to 1951. I heard the sounds at night, Not rats, not wind, breathing, soft voices, boys crying through stone. If you refuse to sanctify that ground, you must at least never reopen it. The dormitory was their coffin. Do not let them out. Helen's hands trembled as she read the final line. They are still in there, but they are no longer alone. That was the moment her flashlight flickered. The batteries were fresh. The bulb was new, but the beam narrowed, sputtered, and briefly went out, leaving her in full darkness. When it returned, she was facing the hallway again. The door behind her had swung halfway shut. She had not touched it. The journal, heavy in her coat pocket, pressed against her like a weight of the dead. Helen backed slowly out of the room, marking her path. She made her way down the corridor toward the main chapel. The journals had mentioned something about the altar, that it was built over the heart of the foundation. That wording had puzzled her at first, but now, as she examined the raised platform, she saw a subtle seam running along the floor at its base, a concealed hatch. Dust outlined the cracks in a perfect rectangle. When she pressed gently at one corner, the wood groaned, not locked, merely untouched. With great care, she eased it open and aimed her flashlight down into the void. A staircase, stone, steep, and slick with condensation. It descended into utter blackness, and the air rising from it was warm. In a building that hadn't held heat in over 60 years, she descended 7 steps before she stopped. Her beam landed on something half buried at the base of the staircase. A narrow iron cross, no taller than her knee, wrapped in tattered red cloth. Beneath it, scrawled in chalk on the step itself, were 3 words: Filii non dormions. The sons do not sleep. Helen left the hatch open behind her, careful not to linger longer than necessary. She returned to the surface and snapped a photograph of the chapel's interior. Later, when the film was developed, a detail emerged that hadn't been visible at the time. In the upper left corner, between 2 wooden pillars, stood a faint silhouette of a man in a cassock, one hand raised in blessing, the other resting on nothing. But when Helen had been there, the chapel had been empty. She never returned to St. Elias after that day, but her notes, letters, and journal entries, preserved in the Archdiocese archives after her death in 1996, suggested she believed the novices had been buried beneath the seminary floor, not just symbolically, literally, and not alone. The official records of the Archdiocese stated clearly that the dormitory wing of St. Elias Seminary was sanctified and sealed permanently on the 9th day of March, 1862. Yet in a fiscal ledger from the same month, one not intended for public release, Helen Marlowe found a line item that had escaped scrutiny for over a century: payment to D.W. and Sons Excavation Company, labor rendered for overnight clearance, lower structure, seminary solarium. The date matched precisely. The amount paid was unusually high for simple foundation work, and the firm itself, D.W. and Sons, had ceased operations by 1863, with no surviving letters or correspondence. What exactly had been cleared in one night? And why were no architectural permits filed for the sub-level excavation, especially during wartime, when every brick and beam was accounted for? The deeper Helen looked, the more questions emerged. Her most significant lead came not from an official document, but from a priest who had been nearly forgotten. Father Lucien Marceau, a French-born Jesuit who served as visiting lecturer at St. Elias for 2 semesters in 1860 and 1861, had published a brief but deeply unsettling theological tract in 1864 under a pseudonym titled Deus Silens Inter Mortuos, God Silent Among the Dead. It was banned shortly after its release. In it, Marceau described a spiritual phenomenon he had personally witnessed at a Midwestern seminary, though he never named it, where a group of young novices had begun experiencing shared visions after their evening prayers. These visions, according to the text, centered around the presence of a dark choir, unseen voices that mimicked their own prayers, syllable for syllable, but always one word behind. In time, the novices reported hearing these voices even outside the chapel. One even claimed to see the shape of a mouth speaking just behind his own reflection in the mirror. Another left a written note, which Marceau quoted in full. "They are not demons. They are not saints. They are not us, but they wear our faces." The tract was dismissed by the Vatican as metaphysical nonsense, and Marceau was quietly removed from his teaching post. But in her private notes, Helen identified a pattern. Of the 18 novices who died that night, 11 had received direct pastoral guidance from Marceau in the final 3 months of his tenure. She also discovered, by cross-referencing seminary rosters and handwritten retreat logs, that the students he had mentored were the same ones who had submitted troubling confessions in the final week before the tragedy. These confessions, still housed in the seminary's locked archive, shared overlapping language. The voice behind the wall, the second self, the boy in the bed that isn't mine, and more than once, we're not the only ones in the dormitory. It was this phrase that Father Anselm Theriot underlined 3 times in his journal. In one particularly harrowing entry dated just 5 days before the mass death, he wrote, "I visited room 211 this morning. Young brother Caleb had not spoken all night. When I finally asked what troubled him, he wept and pointed toward the window, saying simply, 'He told me it's his room now.' There was no one outside." That same evening, Caleb recorded a passage in his own spiritual journal, one that would not be found until 1987, sealed beneath his desk drawer. It read, "I don't fear death. I fear the waiting room. That's where he said we all go first." The handwriting was faint and the ink had run as if the paper had been damp when written, or damp after. That journal now resides in the basement of the St. Louis Archdiocese Historical Archives, its final pages too fragile to handle without gloves. But the words on that one page have been verified, scanned, and transcribed. Several investigators who have read them report the same sensation, a chill, not of cold, but of being observed, as if the journal doesn't merely recount an experience, but contains it. And the most curious fact of all, room 211, the dormitory cell where Caleb recorded his final entry, is the only one whose door cannot be opened. Not rusted shut, not locked, simply stuck. Even crowbars failed to move it, as if something on the other side is holding it closed. In the months following Helen Marlowe's silent departure from St. Elias, her findings began to circulate discreetly among a small group of church historians and archivists, men and women with clearance high enough to request sealed documents, but curious enough to question why so many had been sealed in the first place. One of these was Father Jonathan Mercer, a Dominican scholar from Chicago with a reputation for investigating ecclesiastical anomalies. He obtained copies of Marlowe's notes and quickly became fixated on one particular discovery. A baptismal ledger from the neighboring St. Brannock's parish dated February 1862, just 2 weeks before the novices' deaths. It contained 18 entries, 18 full baptisms, all for boys aged 17 to 20, all listed under false surnames, each accompanied by an unusual marginal note, transferred from E.P.I.C.T. The abbreviation was unknown to Mercer. It didn't match any diocesan division, seminary order, or Latin reference he could identify. But as he cross-checked other internal directories, he came across a memorandum marked Confidential EPICT, Ecclesiastical Program for Initiates of Contained Theology, dated 1859. The document was sparse, clinical, and redacted in several places, but what remained visible was deeply troubling. The program described a Vatican-sanctioned pilot initiative to train a select group of young male candidates in liturgical containment and cross-boundary doctrine, with a focus on spiritual environments exhibiting preternatural autonomy. In simpler terms, these 18 boys had been chosen not for their piety, but for their unusual sensitivity. They were dreamers, sensitive to patterns others couldn't see, recruited not for seminary education, but for something else entirely. They had not applied to St. Elias. They had been placed there, and the seminary itself, isolated, aging, and built on unconsecrated land, had been selected as the ideal sealed theological laboratory. Mercer, horrified by the implications, traveled to the Vatican archives in hopes of finding corroboration. What he found instead was a single handwritten note folded between pages of a retired cardinal's personal correspondence. The note was unsigned, and much of it unreadable from age and smudged ink, but one line remained clear. The Missouri experiment was not contained. Terminate site. Destroy records. Do not permit exhumation. With this, Father Mercer returned to Missouri under the pretense of compiling a historical account of abandoned diocesan properties. In December 1990, with winter snow coating the trees like a silent warning, he entered the seminary with a maintenance crew tasked with structural integrity assessment. His real aim was beneath the altar. Like Marlowe before him, he found the concealed hatch. But unlike her, he brought tools, cameras, a lantern with backup batteries, and an old bronze crucifix he claimed once belonged to a Carthusian monk who had served in plague-ridden France. It was said to have absorbed prayers during 32 deathbed rites. Mercer descended the stone steps one at a time, murmuring psalms under his breath. The warmth that Helen described was still there, unnatural, wrong, not the warmth of life, the warmth of something that should have been cold, but wasn't. At the bottom of the staircase, he found a narrow corridor, lined with uneven stone. It was silent at first, then, from behind the left wall, he heard it. A single breath, not a sound, a breath, drawn in and held, waiting. Mercer followed the passage to a small underground chamber. The ceiling was low. The air hung thick with old rot. In the center of the room stood a single table, carved from limestone. Not an altar, not a coffin, something in between. And surrounding it, placed at even intervals along the walls, were 18 wooden stools, each identical, each positioned as if for a meeting that had no speaker, no master, no host. Mercer approached the table and saw something carved along the edge. It had been gouged in haste. He traced the inscription with his fingers, Latin again, but this time he knew the phrase, Dormit simul et non surgit, sleep together and do not rise. On the wall beside the table, he found a series of tally marks, 11 vertical scratches, one for each night the boys had reportedly complained of shared visitations, and beneath those, one long horizontal line, followed by 18 short vertical ones. Someone had counted. Someone knew the ending before it happened. Mercer didn't speak of what else he saw in that chamber, not in any public record, but he never returned to the seminary. And 6 months later, he requested reassignment to a monastic order in southern Italy, where he took a vow of silence that lasted until his death in 2009. His final, written statement, dated the day before his departure, was short. We were wrong to hide them below, but it would have been worse to let them out. The site was quietly added to the Archdiocese's internal watch list in 1992, labeled under the ambiguous designation Liminal hazard class 3, a term reserved for structures that exhibited sustained spiritual destabilization following a known event of doctrinal breach. Though not publicized, this classification prohibited any restoration, tourism, or sale of the property. St. Elias Seminary was to remain untouched until such time that sanctified expungement could be guaranteed. But no such right existed, at least none that the church was willing to attempt. Yet silence has its own cost. In 1994, a small group of amateur urban explorers, members of a now-defunct Missouri folklore forum, accessed the property through a broken rear fence and documented their experience. The footage, once uploaded to a long-deleted website, is known only by fragments, but one clip has resurfaced over the years, and its content remains burned into the memories of those who've watched it. The video begins in the eastern hallway. Flashlights flicker across the numbered dormitory doors. The explorers laugh nervously, joking about ghosts, the usual. But as they reach room 211, something changes. One of them stops suddenly. He says he hears someone whispering his name. They press their ears to the door, and for just a moment, the mic picks up another voice, not their own. Just one word. Stay. They flee. The footage cuts. But in the final seconds, the camera swings toward the chapel, and standing at the top of the altar, visible in only 2 frames, is a figure in a cassock holding what appears to be a censer. Smoke trails upward, but the figure casts no shadow. That footage was never investigated by law enforcement. The explorers refused interviews. Within months, the forum disbanded. The original uploader, a 19-year-old named Thomas Grady, was later committed to a psychiatric facility in Springfield after a reported breakdown during a Sunday church service. According to the official report, he began screaming during the homily. They're not buried. They never went down. His medical file is sealed. But one detail slipped through. A handwritten note in his evaluation. Grady insists there's a 19th novice no one ever recorded. Says he was left behind. Says he's still waiting to be found. This claim, though easily dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed mind, caught the attention of Sister Miriam Wallace, a Benedictine archivist with experience in post-trauma religious psychology. She was the first person to consider that Grady's 19th novice might not be a hallucination, but a clue. She returned to the original 1862 roster of St. Elias Seminary and re-examined the names listed as present during the final term. 18 were clearly labeled as novices in training, but one name, Julian Ardach, appeared in a separate ledger entirely, listed as special placement, non-initiated auxiliary. His birth date was uncertain, no hometown, no recorded baptism, and no family ever came to claim him. According to a marginal note in Father Theriot's handwriting, Julian was permitted dormitory residence under provisional silence. What that meant, no one could say, but it raised the question, was there a 19th novice? And if so, what became of him when the others died? Sister Miriam visited the seminary site in June 1995 under official sanction. Her aim was not excavation, merely observation, but her written report, stored within the Vatican's restricted archive, is chilling. She described a scent lingering in the lower corridor, like oil and cold stone. She mentioned mirrors fogging without explanation, but most unsettling was her final observation. There are 18 doors, but there is space for 19. The final door frame at the far end of the hallway has no door, only a blank plaster wall. The numbering ends at 218, but if the layout is consistent, and it is, Then there should be a door labeled 219. Instead, there's only smooth white stone, faintly warped, like something was sealed from the inside. Sister Miriam's final line was brief, but unforgettable. "I think Julian never left, and she wasn't alone." If Julian Ardagh truly existed, then his absence from all post-mortem records becomes more than an archival error. It becomes a deliberate omission. But to understand the implications of his erasure, we must first examine the few surviving accounts that mention his name. A letter dated October 1861 from Father Anselm Theriot to his superior in St. Louis includes a curious paragraph. The auxiliary boy, Julian, continues to dwell in silence. He takes no meals with the others, though he consumes what is left by his door. He does not join in prayer, yet kneels at the correct hours. No one taught him this, yet he knows the Psalms by heart. Brother Elias says he caught the boy whispering Latin phrases that do not appear in our breviary. I have taken to keeping incense near his room. The letter offers no further elaboration, but the tone suggests growing unease. And in Father Theriot's journal, one entry dated just 6 days before the novices' deaths stands out in its intensity. Julian stood in the chapel after compline, motionless, for nearly an hour. The other boys had gone. I asked if he was waiting for someone. He said, "They're almost ready." I asked who. He answered, "The ones who listen beneath." I pressed further, but he turned away and said, "They don't want to wait anymore." The handwriting shifts noticeably at the end of the entry, the script uneven, letters heavy, as if the pen were pressed harder into the page. Theriot underlined one sentence: "He was not brought here. He arrived." This aligns with the oral accounts that began to surface in the late 1990s, primarily from descendants of the surrounding towns. Those who had heard family rumors, whispered warnings passed through generations. One particularly disturbing claim came from a woman named Edith McKellar, whose grandfather worked briefly as a groundskeeper assistant at St. Elia during the winter of 1861. In a recorded interview from 1998, Edith recalls, "My grandfather said there was a boy who came from the woods. Said he wasn't brought by clergy, didn't ride in with the others. He just appeared one day at Vespers, dirty, barefoot, silent. They let him stay because he never caused trouble. But he was always cold, always soaking wet, even when it hadn't rained. Said the other boys avoided him. Called him Julian the Hollow." That phrase, Julian the Hollow, appears one other time in surviving documentation. In the personal diary of Brother Matthias, a junior instructor at the seminary who perished along with the others, there is a scrawled page dated January 2nd, 1862. Julian has not slept in 3 nights. His eyes are dry, but he does not blink. Tonight, he walked the hallway backwards, touching each door frame. He stopped at mine and whispered, "One of you will not rise." Then he smiled. I haven't slept since. The diary ends there. Brother Matthias's body was found in his bed with a look of frozen terror on his face. The coroner noted no signs of trauma, but he did note that the sheets were damp, as though the boy had drowned in a bed without water. That phrase, "drowned without water," appears again decades later in a chilling 2002 account by a private team of paranormal researchers who managed to sneak onto the seminary grounds one final time before the structure was fully sealed in 2004. Among the team was a forensic pathologist named Dr. Lionel Rees, whose report remains unpublished but was leaked through anonymous sources. Dr. Rees documented strange humidity in room 219, or rather, the wall where room 219 should be. "The stone was cold," he wrote, "but it sweated, like flesh, not with condensation, with perspiration. I touched it. It pulsed." His assistant, a young man named Martin Klein, reportedly collapsed moments later after complaining of pressure in his chest. When revived, he kept repeating a single sentence over and over. He doesn't want to be forgotten. He's still here. They left the premises that same night. Neither of them ever returned, and in a private email later recovered from Dr. Reese's correspondence, he wrote to a colleague, "If Julian Ardoch was not human, then what we sealed behind that wall in 1862 was not a boy. It was something using his shape, and if it's still here, then sealing the door may have only kept it patient, not gone." In 2006, under quiet authorization from the Archdiocese's Department of Historical Affairs, an investigative committee was formed. Officially, its mandate was to assess structural decay and historical value for potential preservation of diocesan assets. Unofficially, it was a last attempt to answer a growing unease, one that had lingered for 144 years and could no longer be ignored. Leading the committee was Monsignor Philip Lantrow, a scholar priest known for his work in reconsecrating contaminated sites, places where churches had become associated with scandal, sacrilege, or worse. Lantrow was respected, deliberate, and unafraid of difficult truths, but nothing in his long career prepared him for Saint Elias. His team, composed of 2 archivists, a forensic surveyor, and 1 ecclesial historian, arrived at the site on a gray October morning. They brought no media, no cameras, only notebooks, consecrated water, and sacramental oil. The building stood exactly as it had been described for decades, lifeless, intact, and visibly untouched by vandalism, as though even trespassers had sensed a line that should not be crossed. Inside, the temperature dropped sharply. Lantrow noted that despite the chill, the air felt thick, as though it resisted movement. The pews in the chapel had not shifted an inch. The altar showed no signs of dust, no trace of wildlife. But on the eastern wall, the one behind the pulpit, there was a mark none of them had seen in photos or previous documentation. A single handprint pressed in ash or soot, larger than average, too high to reach without aid, and oddly inverted, as if it had been pressed there from above. The surveyor, a practical man named Jensen, tried to dismiss it as trick lighting, but when he touched it, he recoiled. "It's warm," he said, "like the walls breathing." That phrase unnerved Lantrow more than he cared to admit. The team proceeded to the dormitory corridor, counting each door. When they reached the end, rooms 201 through 218 accounted for, they stood before the blank plaster wall. None of them spoke at first. Then the historian, Sister Veronica Leith, whispered the name aloud. Julian. As if summoned, a low, creaking sound echoed from behind the wall. They later insisted it was likely shifting stone, pressure differences, or subsurface movement, but no structural instability was ever found. The wall was firm, solid, uneven only at the edges, where a faint outline of a sealed frame could be traced beneath the layers of plaster, proof that room 219 had once existed and had been intentionally concealed. Lantrow ordered a short prayer, a blessing, then silence. In his notes he wrote, "There is presence here, not memory, not history, something ongoing, something unfinished." But it was what happened that night, after they had left the premises, that changed everything. The building was locked behind them, windows secured, no alarms triggered, and yet, when they returned at dawn to resume documentation, they found the door to room 209 ajar. It had been sealed, its hinges rusted, but there it stood, open exactly 5 inches. Inside, the bed was still made, but the pillow was indented, not freshly, not fully, but just enough to suggest someone, or something, had lain there. On the wall above the headboard, written in ash, was a phrase in Latin, omnis sanguis vocat, all blood calls out. Sister Veronica collapsed moments after reading it aloud. She later described the sensation as drowning without water, a feeling of being remembered by something that shouldn't remember her. The team left that day. The investigation was terminated within the week. Lontrose submitted a 17-page internal report, most of which remains classified. But one page, mistakenly leaked in 2008, included a line scrawled in the margin: "The dormitory is not a tomb, it is a waiting room, and something still waits." The committee disbanded. St. Elias was ordered fully sealed, its ground fenced and its existence quietly omitted from diocesan property lists. But a few, those who had walked its halls, felt its air, read its walls, never forgot. And in their private letters, they spoke of one certainty: the seminary was not empty. It had never been empty. Something had been left behind, or perhaps it had never left at all. In 2012, following the death of Archbishop Emeritus Samuel Eckhart, a sealed wooden crate was discovered in the attic of the diocesan retreat house in Cape Girardeau. Inside were 14 volumes of handwritten correspondence, each tied with red twine and marked in Latin, privatum ad usum internum. Among these were dozens of letters from Father Anselm Theriot, previously believed lost or destroyed, written during the final 30 days of the seminary's operation. What they described was not merely a spiritual crisis, but a slow, coordinated descent into fearful silence. In his letter dated December 28, 1861, Theriot wrote, "I can no longer trust the hours of the day. Time behaves oddly here. Last night I heard the supper bell ring at midnight. No one else did. The novices are restless. Elijah mutters psalms in reverse. Caleb refuses to eat. Brother Matthias said he found Julian sitting upright in his bed, whispering to someone who was not there." The following entry, December 30th. "The boys gathered in the chapel unprompted. No instructor led them. They sat in silence. All faced the altar. I asked what they were doing. One said, 'We are preparing to be remembered.' The others nodded. I inquired, 'Remembered by whom?' No answer. And then on January 1st, 1862, 'There are footsteps that do not belong to us. Every night now, the floorboards creak, but no one is there. Shadows move with no source. Candles refuse to stay lit past midnight. And room 219, it seeps. Not liquid, but something like memory. Regret with weight. I dream of voices behind the wall.' These entries confirmed what many had feared. The seminary was not suffering from disease, neglect, or madness. It was responding to something. And Father Theriot's final letter, dated January 3rd, the same night the 18 novices were found dead, was never sent. It was sealed in an envelope marked simply, 'For absolution, if I am wrong.' In it he wrote, 'Tonight I performed rites not sanctioned by Rome. I sprinkled oil around room 219 and read from the book of Job. I heard movement inside, not scurrying, not shifting, something large, breathing. I repeated the rite 3 times. When I returned to the chapel, Julian stood in the pulpit. I asked how he got there. He said, 'The walls do not keep out what belongs.' Then he smiled. 'They're ready now.' The rest of the letter descends into fragmented sentences, ink running as though the pen were shaking violently, but 3 lines remain intact. It was never the novices. They were the offering. It was him. It was always him. What's chilling is the timing. Parish records confirm that Julian Ardoch was not present when the bodies were discovered. His bedding was untouched, his cell empty. His possessions, few as they were, neatly arranged. A rosary, a blank journal, and a small iron key with no corresponding lock. The door to room 219 by then had already been plastered over, not by builders, not by stoneworkers, but by priests working by candlelight. The very next day, 5 senior clergy arrived by horse-drawn coach. They did not bring physicians. They did not perform autopsies. Instead, they held a closed-door liturgy. No public record exists of the ritual performed. But in the Archdiocese's private ledger, beneath the line item St. Elia Dormitory Closure, is a Latin phrase seldom used in modern rite. Lex custodita. Vox silenda. The law is guarded. The voice must remain silent. And for the next 150 years, it did. Though the seminary had been shuttered in early 1862 and the church claimed it was never reopened, the surrounding communities felt its presence long after the final rites were performed. Within 2 years, 3 nearby parishes reported identical disturbances, each tied inexplicably to families of boys who had once applied to St. Elias but were never accepted. In one parish, a priest's homily was interrupted by a deafening sound of the bells, though the church had none. In another, several congregants claimed to hear the voice of a child reciting Latin beneath the floorboards during midnight mass. These were dismissed as hysteria, but in the winter of 1865, at St. Drostan's Parish, an altar boy named Marcus Renner vanished between evening vespers and the walk home. His cloak and gloves were found folded neatly on the church steps. The only witness, a cleaning woman preparing candles, said she saw Marcus speaking to a boy in the vestibule, dressed like a seminarian but wet, dripping like he had come from the river. When she approached, the stranger was gone. Marcus was never found. The parish closed within the year. Records from that period make only veiled references, often in euphemism. Terms like resonant grief, ecclesial unrest, and structural spiritual stain appear in correspondence between clergy, yet never make their way into public reports. But one private letter, discovered decades later in the estate of Archbishop Remy Courcelle, makes the most explicit connection. Dated March 1866, it reads, "We have not stopped the wound. We have only hidden it. It spreads in silence, in unspoken prayers. They come to the churches now. Not many, but one at a time, always just before dusk, always asking the same thing. Is there room for one more novice?" The phrase "room for one more" begins to appear in parish logs as far west as Kansas City by 1871. A strange child, pale, soaked, unblinking, appearing at rectory doors, always alone, always asking the same question. In most cases, he would vanish if denied entry, but in 2 documented instances, the priests allowed him in, believing him to be an orphan or a late applicant. In both cases, the priests were found dead the next morning. No wounds, no struggle, just lifeless, as if something had been quietly claimed. Those entries were struck from the record shortly after, but survivors from those parishes, elderly now, scattered across rural Missouri, tell stories passed down from their grandparents, not of ghosts, not of demons, but of echoes. They speak of prayers said in duplicate, of dreams featuring halls with too many doors, and of bell towers ringing when the rope is still. One man, interviewed anonymously in 1984, described a recurring nightmare his mother had until her death. She saw a classroom full of boys sitting motionless, pale skin, black cassocks, but they weren't breathing. Then one boy would turn and say, "You've already heard our names. That means you're coming next." When asked what she meant, the man replied, "She said if you knew their names, they knew yours." This line, cryptic, terrifying, echoes the seminary's original death ledger. The names of the 18 novices were recorded, but next to Julian Ardach's name was a blank, a space, as if his name wasn't forgotten, but withheld. And if the stories are to be believed, that name still waits to be spoken. by someone willing to hear it. By 2015, the story of Saint Elias Seminary had become a curiosity, whispered in dark corners of theology forums, amateur ghost channels, and online archives of forbidden Catholic history. Most dismissed it as apocryphal, another tale born from misremembered documents and the Church's long record of secrecy. But not everyone could turn away. One such figure was Dr. Ava Gray, an academic with no formal ties to the Church, but with a PhD in ecclesiastical architecture and a growing obsession with locations of theological interruption, sites where belief and structure collapsed together. She obtained a digital copy of the leaked throughout letters in late 2014. By March 2015, she was standing in front of the seminary herself. The gates had rusted open. The fence was broken in 2 places. No cameras, no guards, just a place quietly vanishing in the trees, waiting to be remembered. Gray was methodical. Over 3 days, she mapped the floor plan, sketched the exterior wall seams, and studied the chapel's stained glass, most of which was intact, but unnervingly reversed. A detail few had noticed before. The images were mirrored, as if intended to be read from outside, as if the building faced inward. On the 4th day, she did what no one else had attempted since the last church-sanctioned inspection. She broke open the plaster wall covering room 219. The barrier gave way slowly, layers of lime and stone chipping into dust. Behind it, not a doorway, but a narrow passage. The air that emerged was dry, but heavy. The passage extended 8 feet before opening into a square cell, barely larger than a closet. The floor was made of smoothed concrete. No bed, no chair, no crucifix. Only the walls, covered top to bottom in writing. Latin phrases carved with something sharp, etched into stone, some familiar, memento mori, fiat voluntas tua. Others, unknown to Gray, fragments of untranslated scripture, reversed psalms, invented prayers, and at the far end, a single phrase repeated dozens of times, each carved deeper than the last. Et ego vigilo, and I am watching. Gray's flashlight dimmed, the battery supposedly fresh, her skin prickled with static. She reported no sound, no movement, but when she turned to leave, she saw something on the floor that hadn't been there before. A rosary, old, rusted, missing 1 bead, and in the center, a medallion marked with an image she didn't recognize. Not Christ, not Mary, but something with 2 faces, one weeping, one smiling. The inscription was in Latin, badly worn but legible. Quod sacrificatum est non requiescit. What has been sacrificed does not rest. Gray fled. She never returned. Her journal entries, preserved by her assistant, stop abruptly after that day. Her final note reads, "The cell is not a room. It's a mirror, not for the body, for the voice. The name waits for an echo." In the following weeks, she reportedly suffered from night terrors. Always the same dream. 18 young men standing in silence, eyes closed, heads bowed. Behind them, a 19th figure, taller, head raised, eyes open, watching, always watching. Her health declined rapidly. No diagnosis. In December 2015, she was admitted to a private facility after collapsing in her office. When asked if she remembered what triggered the episode, her assistant said she was staring at an old blueprint of the seminary, tracing the line where room 219 had once been, whispering a single word, Julian. That name again, spoken aloud, as if once heard, it begins to echo, and once echoed, it wants to answer. In 2018, under mounting pressure from a group of independent scholars and forensic theologians, the Missouri State Historical Society, unaffiliated with the Catholic Church, petitioned for a controlled excavation of the St. Elia grounds under the pretense of cultural preservation. They received limited access for 72 hours. The church did not officially endorse the effort, but it did not stop it either. As one official said off record, "They won't find anything we haven't already buried." The excavation was led by Dr. Marcus Held, a forensic anthropologist known for mass grave investigations in Eastern Europe. He had no interest in ghost stories. He was interested in bones, soil composition, evidence. Within 6 hours, his team had cleared the western edge of the cemetery grounds, the area where, by all records, the 18 novices were never buried. And yet, what they found contradicted everything. Precisely 18 depressions in the soil, rectangular, spaced evenly, like graves. But here's the anomaly: no coffins, no human remains. Instead, at the center of each depression, buried just under 6 inches of soil, were white stones, smooth, polished, and arranged in cruciform, each one marked with a single carved letter. The team documented them in sequence. Together, they formed a phrase in Latin, "non sumus mortui." "We are not dead." Held was unsettled, but not convinced. His team moved next to the sublevel beneath the chapel, the area previously accessed only by Marlowe and Mercer. This time, the excavation was more aggressive. Walls were cored, ground-penetrating radar used. What they found confirmed what the church had long feared, but never confessed. The substructure beneath the dormitory did not end at the foundation. A secondary chamber, octagonal, fortified with stone, and not appearing on any blueprint, extended beneath room 219. When the team breached it, the air rushed out like a breath held too long. Inside, a single stone basin, and around it 18 recesses in the floor, not graves, not bunks, but slots, human length, shallow, each lined with red fibers, long since rotted into powder. No bones, no cloth. But in one slot, the one farthest from the basin, they found a fragment of parchment somehow preserved. Faded ink, barely legible, written in Theriot's hand. It read, "We did not bury them. We laid them down. The rite was never completed. They were not taken. They were left. Julian began it. But Julian did not finish it, and now the name has no end." The forensic team vacated the chamber by nightfall. Within 48 hours, the archdiocese petitioned the governor to revoke further access. The reason cited: preservation of religious land and prevention of desecration. But the real reason came from a conversation, one overheard by a member of the dig team, between two church officials standing beside the chapel the next morning. One asked, "Should we finally remove the altar?" The other replied, "No. It's not covering something. It's holding something in." The chamber was resealed. The seminary refenced. But every member of that 2018 team, all 6 of them, later reported similar symptoms: insomnia, auditory hallucinations, recurring dreams of cold water, reversed prayers, and in 2 cases, waking to find Latin phrases scrawled in condensation on their mirrors. Phrases they didn't understand. One man, an agnostic historian named Carl Vinton, broke down in an interview months later. When asked what he thought the seminary had been, he whispered, "It was never a school. It was a door." He paused, tears welling. "And it's not fully closed." When asked what he believed Julian Ardagh was, Vinton didn't answer. He just said, "Ask him yourself. He's listening." Following the unofficial leak of the 2018 excavation report, the archdiocese quietly assembled a final internal commission, not to investigate, but to contain, headed by Cardinal Emeritus Lawrence Hagen. This commission met only twice, behind closed doors, and produced no formal minutes. But through private correspondence later obtained by academic whistleblowers, one phrase appeared repeatedly across their notes: "Lex tenebris, vox viventium, the law of darkness, the voice of the living. What terrified the commission was not what had been discovered underground, but what had begun happening above it. In the year following the breach of Room 219E's foundation chamber, strange phenomena were reported within a 12-mile radius of the site. At St. Adele's Chapel, 2 priests suffered simultaneous hallucinations during midnight adoration. Both claimed to see a choir of young men in black cassocks standing silently along the chapel walls, eyes closed, lips moving in reverse. At the Rivermount Monastery, novices began reporting dreams they had never dreamed before. Visions of walking down endless stone hallways, always following a boy just out of reach. They could never see his face, only his soaked robes and his bare, blood-darkened feet. And at a nearby Catholic school, 5 children were caught writing unfamiliar words in Latin on the walls of the gymnasium. When asked where they learned them, each child gave the same answer: Julian taught us. By 2020, internal church memos began referring to these events not as hauntings, but as ripples. One document reads, "Containment was architectural. When the wall came down, it did not release a spirit. It released a memory too heavy to forget. And now it looks for new stone to cling to." The term used in later reports is transference. The idea that whatever was trapped beneath room 219, whether spirit, sin, or something unnamed, may not have been bound to geography, but to recognition. Once the story was known, once the name was spoken, the threshold was crossed, and with it came consequences. In 2021, an anonymous letter arrived at the Diocese of Jefferson City, postmarked from Canada. It contained no return address, no explanation, only a page torn from a child's notebook. On it, in a shaky child's hand, "I dreamed of 18 boys. They were lying down, not sleeping. One looked at me. He said, 'You know our name now. That means we're listening.'" Beneath the drawing was a crude outline of a church drawn from memory, with 19 windows. The seminary only had 18, but room 219 was never meant to be seen. In the final sealed letter written by Cardinal Hagen before his death in 2022, he warned, "The danger is not the boy, it is the echo, the shape that memory takes when it waits too long. We sealed the chamber, but we did not unhear the name, and once it is heard, it begins to look for its voice again." That line would be quoted quietly among a small network of theological exorcists who now refer to places like St. Elias as residual thrones, sites where unfulfilled rituals give shape to autonomous spiritual residue. In simpler terms, places where silence becomes a mouth, and where forgotten boys, especially ones never buried, wait not to be mourned, but to be spoken. It is no longer about Julian Ardok alone. The Church understands this now. He was never the ending. He was the permission, the question, the word at the center of the prayer no one dared say. And now that it has been spoken by too many, too often, the echo is forming teeth, and it does not forgive easily. The last known artifact recovered from the ruins of St. Elias did not come from beneath the dormitory, nor from the chapel's foundation, but from a hollow inside the seminary's main crucifix, discovered only by accident when the structure was removed in late 2022 for preservation. Inside the wood, a rolled parchment sealed with wax. It was dated January 3rd, 1862, the night the novices were found. The handwriting was Theriot's. Its contents were not a confession, not a prayer, but an instruction. If this place is ever opened again, speak the litany in reverse. Start not with forgiveness, but with forgetting. Call each by name except the last. The last must remain unwritten. For the 19th is not to be spoken. He is the door, and once the door is called by name, he will no longer wait. The instruction ended there. No key, no liturgical code, only fear, only the echo of a warning. Do not finish the list. And yet, over the years, the list has been finished, pieced together through leaked documents, oral accounts, and recovered archives. 18 names, all accounted for. One missing. And though no official record confirms it, a growing number of researchers, religious and secular alike, now believe that Julian Ardagh was not the 19th novice. He was the first. The others came after, drawn to him, formed around him like ribs around a spine. He was not a victim of the seminary. He was its origin, the unspoken wound they built a holy place around, hoping structure and ritual would contain what had no name. But buildings rot, records fade, and the church, for all its power, could only hold the silence for so long. Today, the seminary is overgrown. The walls sag inward, but no one dares bulldoze it. Not for superstition, not for preservation, but for fear that what lies beneath its foundation is not dead, not even dormant, but listening, watching, waiting for the next name, for the next soul willing to learn the litany and speak it in full. We are left with this: a sealed room, a vanished boy, a cemetery with no bodies, and a building that refuses to fall. It remains not because of architecture, but because some silences anchor themselves in time, and once you hear them, you carry them, not as memory, but as invitation. Julian Ardagh may never be proven real. No photo, no baptismal record, but those who have walked the dormitory corridor agree. There is always one door more than you remember. Always a room that wasn't there before. Always the sound of someone waiting to be found. And if, one night, you hear your name spoken from behind that wall, not shouted, not whispered, just spoken like a fact, you'll know. The seminary has remembered you because you remembered it, and now the voice is no longer alone. It has yours.